He didn't lower his voice. That was the part that made it unforgivable. Winifred doesn't understand restraint, Augustus Blackwood said, his smile warm and indulgent, as if he were sharing gentle wisdom rather than destroying my credibility in front of 14 board members and senior executives. The boardroom laughed. Softly, obediently, the way people laugh when someone powerful makes a joke at someone else's expense. They weren't laughing at humor. They were laughing at alignment, showing Augustus that they understood the hierarchy, that they knew which side of this moment mattered. He gestured toward my presentation still glowing on the screen behind him. 23 slides detailing a market expansion strategy I'd spent 6 months developing. Data-driven, carefully researched, backed by analysis from 3 different consulting firms. This is what happens when you confuse access with ability, he continued, his tone still pleasant, almost kind. Winifred has been given opportunities far beyond her experience level. It's natural that she'd overreach. The heat started at my collar and climbed toward my face. My presentation notes were still clutched in my hand. My laptop sat open on the table where I'd been standing just moments before Augustus had interrupted my 3rd slide to provide some context for the board. I hadn't even been allowed to sit back down. I just stood there, frozen, while he systematically dismantled 2 years of work. No one offered me a chair. No one made eye contact. No one interrupted Augustus to suggest that maybe I should be allowed to finish my presentation before it was critiqued. I stood at the side of the room while my mentor, the man who'd recruited me, promoted me, championed me publicly for 18 months, explained to the board why my strategic proposal was evidence of poor judgment and insufficient understanding of enterprise-level decision-making. The people who'd congratulated me in private emails when they'd reviewed early drafts now studied their notepads or scrolled through their phones. Marcus Webb, the CFO who'd called my financial projections the most thorough analysis I've seen in years, examined his coffee cup like it contained secrets. Vanessa Cruz, who'd asked if she could use my market research for her own division, suddenly needed to check her watch repeatedly. Someone cleared their throat uncomfortably. Someone else shifted in their seat. The discomfort in the room wasn't because Augustus was being cruel. It was because they had to witness it and pretend they didn't see anything wrong. I appreciate Winifred's enthusiasm, Augustus said, that word, enthusiasm, turning my professional work into childish eagerness. But we'll be moving forward without her involvement in this particular initiative. I'll be restructuring the expansion strategy under more experienced leadership. Just like that. My career trajectory, reframed as a cautionary tale about ambition exceeding capability. His smile never wavered. That's what I'd remember most later, how much he enjoyed this. Augustus Blackwood was 62 years old, worth approximately $4 billion, and known throughout the tech industry as a visionary leader and generous mentor to young talent. He'd built Blackwood Enterprises from a small consulting firm into a diversified portfolio of companies spanning software, real estate, and venture capital. He was also known for his mentorship program. Every few years, he'd identify someone promising, usually young, usually hungry, always talented, and bring them into his inner circle. Access to board meetings, executive strategy sessions, high-level networking events that could accelerate a career by a decade. I'd been his current protégé for 18 months. Recruited directly from a mid-level position at a competing firm because Augustus had been impressed by my strategic thinking. Promoted quickly to Senior Director of Strategy and Innovation. Given visibility and opportunities I'd never have accessed on my own timeline. And now, in front of the same board he'd introduced me to so proudly, he was explaining why I'd failed to meet expectations. Why my work, while enthusiastic, lacked the sophistication required at this level. Why he'd been perhaps too optimistic about my readiness for senior leadership. The smile was what made it clear, this wasn't disappointment. This was performance. He was enjoying demonstrating his power, showing the board, and showing me, exactly who controlled narratives and careers in this room. Thank you, Winifred, Augustus said, his tone suggesting the meeting was over. We appreciate your effort on this. I'll follow up with you separately about your role moving forward. That was it. Dismissed. The presentation I'd spent 6 months preparing, cut off at slide 3. The market expansion strategy that could have positioned Blackwood Enterprises to dominate an emerging sector, reduced to an example of overreach. The board members were already moving on, pulling up the next agenda item, asking Augustus about quarterly projections. Like I'd never been there. Like my presentation had been a brief interruption rather than a scheduled 45-minute strategic review. I closed my laptop, gathered my notes, walked to the door with my spine straight and my expression neutral, even though my hands were shaking with humiliation and rage. At the door, I paused. Looked back. Augustus was already deep in conversation with the CFO, animated and engaged, his earlier dismissal of me completely forgotten. Or not forgotten, just irrelevant. I'd served my purpose, a demonstration of his judgment, his authority, his power to elevate and destroy careers with equal ease. I walked out. Didn't slam the door. Didn't cry in the hallway. Didn't confront him or demand explanation or make any of the emotional scenes he probably expected. I just disappeared from the office for the rest of the day. Went home. And started reading through my original employment contract with Blackwood Enterprises. Very carefully. I didn't cry. That seemed to bother him more than anything. The next morning, Augustus's assistant called. Augustus would like to meet with you this afternoon at 3. He wants to discuss your ongoing role and make sure you understand the decision made yesterday. I accepted the meeting politely. Professional. No emotion in my voice. When I arrived at his office, Augustus greeted me warmly, as if nothing had happened. Winifred, come in. I wanted to touch base after yesterday's board meeting. I know it might have felt abrupt, but I thought we should have a frank conversation about expectations. He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where he'd sat me 18 months ago to offer the position that had changed my career trajectory. The same chair where he told me I had extraordinary potential and that he saw real leadership capability in me. I'm concerned that you might have misunderstood the purpose of yesterday's presentation, he began, his voice gentle, almost fatherly. When I gave you the strategic expansion project, I intended it as a learning opportunity. A chance to develop your thinking at an enterprise scale. I wasn't expecting you to present it to the board as a formal proposal. I met his eyes steadily. You put it on the board agenda yourself. 3 weeks ago. Scheduled 45 minutes for my presentation. He smiled. As a developmental exercise. So the board could provide feedback. I certainly didn't expect you to position it as a ready-for execution strategy. My name is Winifred Hale, and I was 31 years old when Augustus Blackwood made me visible, entirely on his terms. Before Blackwood Enterprises, I'd spent 7 years building expertise in market analysis and strategic planning. I'd worked my way up from junior analyst to strategy lead at a mid-sized consulting firm, earning respect through careful work and documented results. I'd never been the loudest voice in meetings. Never been the most visible self-promoter. But I'd built a reputation for thorough research, creative problem-solving, and strategies that actually worked when implemented. Augustus had approached me at an industry conference. I've been watching your career, he'd said. You have something rare, the ability to see patterns before they become obvious. I could use that kind of thinking at Blackwood. The offer had been extraordinary. Senior director title. Significant salary increase. Direct access to executive leadership and board-level strategy discussions. I don't just hire people, Augustus had explained. I build careers. I identify talent that others overlook and give them platforms they couldn't access otherwise. It had felt like validation. Recognition that my years of careful work had been noticed by someone who could accelerate my trajectory beyond what I could achieve alone. What I hadn't understood then was the price of that visibility. Augustus didn't build careers. He built dependencies. He created success stories that existed entirely within his orbit, entirely subject to his continued approval. He'd called it mentorship. It had been ownership. Over 18 months, I'd learned how Augustus's system worked. He'd identify talented people, bring them into his sphere, give them opportunities and visibility they couldn't refuse. And in exchange, they became his. Their successes were attributed to his judgment in recognizing them. Their work became extensions of his vision. Their careers existed at his pleasure. I'd watched it happen to others. The talented young CFO who'd questioned one of Augustus's acquisition strategies and found himself suddenly better suited to a smaller subsidiary role. The brilliant product lead who'd received credit for innovation during successful launches but was blamed for execution failures when market conditions shifted. The VP of operations who'd been publicly praised at board meetings until she wasn't, her contributions suddenly reframed as derivative of Augustus's guidance rather than her own expertise. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Augustus elevated people just high enough to make their fall visible. He built them up in ways that made them grateful, dependent, convinced their success was only possible through his continued patronage. And when they became too confident, too independent, or simply when he needed to demonstrate his power, he'd orchestrate their public diminishment. It was never cruel. Always regretful. They had such potential, but they weren't ready for this level. I believed in them, but they couldn't handle the pressure. I tried to help, but they couldn't accept guidance. The narrative was always about his generous attempt to develop someone who'd ultimately disappointed. He called it mentorship. I understood it was a favor, the kind that created permanent debt. I've given you opportunities you could never have accessed on your own, Augustus had said during one of our early meetings. Not in a threatening way. Almost kindly, like he was helping me understand how the world worked. People spend decades trying to get the kind of access you have to board-level strategy and executive decision-making. I'm accelerating your timeline by 10 years. It was true. The visibility alone was invaluable. Speaking to boards, presenting to executives, building relationships with industry leaders who'd never have taken my calls otherwise. Augustus's endorsement opened doors that my own credentials, however strong, couldn't have opened as quickly. But there was an implicit contract beneath the explicit one. This access existed because Augustus willed it. The moment he withdrew his endorsement, those doors would close just as quickly as they'd opened. Perhaps faster, because people would wonder what I'd done to lose his confidence. I expect loyalty in return, he'd said. Not demanding. Just stating obvious fact. When I invest in someone this way, I need to know they understand the value of what they've been given. That they won't use my platform to undermine me or pursue their own agenda at the company's expense. It sounded reasonable at the time. Of course I wouldn't undermine him. Of course I'd be loyal to the person who'd given me extraordinary opportunities. Why wouldn't I be? What I hadn't realized was that loyalty meant agreement. Meant deference. Meant never developing enough independent credibility to be seen as anything other than Augustus's creation. I wasn't the first woman sidelined this way. That became clear as I started asking quiet questions after the board meeting humiliation. Keisha Hamilton had been Augustus's protégé 4 years ago. Brilliant data scientist, brought in to lead Blackwood's AI research division. Highly visible for 2 years, presenting at conferences, featured in industry publications as an example of Augustus's commitment to diverse leadership. Then she disagreed with Augustus about the commercial viability of a particular algorithm. Not publicly. In a private strategy meeting. She'd suggested postponing launch to address some technical limitations. Within 3 months, she'd been transitioned to an advisory role with no direct reports and minimal involvement in actual projects. Augustus had framed it as Keisha wanting to focus more on research than management. Keisha had left the company 6 months later, her reputation damaged by whispered concerns about whether she'd been ready for executive leadership after all. Before Keisha, there'd been Simone Torres. Before Simone, Alexandria Wright. A pattern of talented women elevated quickly, given high visibility, then quietly sidelined when they showed signs of independent thinking or when Augustus needed to demonstrate his authority. The men he mentored lasted longer, generally. Stayed in his orbit even after they'd moved to other roles or companies. Maintained the relationship as mutually beneficial networking rather than hierarchical control. But the women who challenged him, questioned him, or simply outgrew needing his endorsement. They were reframed as cautionary tales about potential versus performance. That night, I reread my original employment agreement with Blackwood Enterprises. Not the standard corporate contract most employees signed. A specialized agreement Augustus used for his leadership development program participants. I'd signed it eagerly 18 months ago, barely noticing the details beyond salary, title, and start date. Now I read every clause carefully, looking for what I'd missed. Standard provisions about confidentiality, non-competition, intellectual property. Expected for any senior role. But there were other clauses, buried in legal language, that I glossed over initially but now understood differently. Section 7.3, employee acknowledges that opportunities for professional development, including but not limited to board presentations, executive strategy sessions, and external speaking engagements, are provided at company discretion and may be modified or withdrawn based on business needs and performance evaluations. Translation. Augustus could cut off my access to visibility whenever he chose, framing it as performance-based rather than punitive. Section 9.2. Employee agrees that work product developed during employment, including strategic analyses, market research, and business proposals, constitutes work for hire belonging exclusively to Blackwood Enterprises, regardless of whether formally implemented. Translation. Everything I'd created, including the market expansion strategy he just publicly dismissed, legally belonged to the company. He could use my work without crediting me or compensate me beyond my salary. But then I found Section 12.4. And everything changed. Section 12.4 was labeled Governance Oversight and Fiduciary Responsibility. It was dense legal language that most people would skim without understanding the implications. In the event that employee, in the course of employment duties, becomes aware of potential governance concerns, conflicts of interest, or fiduciary responsibility questions related to executive leadership or board oversight, employee has the right to request independent review through the company's governance committee without retaliation or adverse employment action. I read it 3 times. Then I pulled up the company's organizational documents to understand what the governance committee actually was. Blackwood Enterprises, despite being privately held and dominated by Augustus's personality, had a formal governance structure required by its investors and institutional lenders. A board of directors with independent members, an audit committee, and a governance committee responsible for reviewing executive conduct, potential conflicts of interest, and fiduciary duty compliance. The governance committee existed mainly as a formality. In practice, Augustus ran the company with minimal interference. The committee met quarterly, reviewed standard reports, and approved everything Augustus recommended. But according to Section 12.4, any employee, including me, had the right to request that the governance committee conduct an independent review of potential concerns. And doing so was explicitly protected from retaliation. I'd never noticed this clause before. Probably because Augustus had never mentioned it when walking me through the employment agreement. It was buried in page 17 of a 23-page contract, using language that sounded procedural rather than powerful. But it was there. A clause no one thought I'd understand or use. I didn't confront Augustus. Didn't send angry emails or demand explanations. Didn't post on social media about mentor betrayal or toxic leadership. I simply disappeared from visibility. Stopped attending optional meetings. Declined invitations to networking events. Became quiet and compliant in the few interactions we had, accepting his developmental feedback with neutral acknowledgement. Augustus seemed satisfied with this. The prodigal protégé had learned her lesson, accepted her limitations, understood her place. He was gracious about it, even. Made sure to mention my valuable contributions in contexts where he needed to demonstrate magnanimity. 2 weeks after the board meeting humiliation, I sent a formal letter to the governance committee. Professional, specific, carefully worded. I am writing to request an independent review under Section 12.4 of my employment agreement regarding potential governance concerns related to executive leadership practices, specifically concerning the development, presentation, and attribution of strategic initiatives. I have documentation of work product developed under executive direction that was subsequently presented to the board with altered attribution and decision-making context. I believe this raises questions about governance transparency and appropriate oversight of executive authority that warrant independent review. I didn't mention Augustus by name. Didn't make accusations. Just requested review of governance concerns with supporting documentation attached. The governance committee was required to respond within 30 days. I settled in to wait. The governance committee consisted of 3 independent board members who weren't involved in day-to-day operations. Harrison Cole, a retired CEO with expertise in corporate governance, Francesca Lim, a law professor specializing in fiduciary duty, and Thomas Brennan, a venture capital partner with experience in multiple board oversight roles. They'd served together for 4 years, approving Augustus's recommendations with minimal discussion. Their meetings were brief, professional, and generally concluded with unanimous votes supporting whatever Augustus had proposed. But they were also serious professionals who took fiduciary responsibility seriously. When my request landed in their formal review queue, they couldn't simply ignore it or defer to Augustus's judgment. Section 12.4 required them to conduct independent assessment. 2 weeks after I submitted my request, I received a formal letter from Harrison Cole, the governance committee chair. The committee has received your request for review under Section 12.4. We are engaging an independent governance consultant to assess the matters you've raised. You will be contacted within 7 business days to schedule an interview. Please prepare all relevant documentation for review. Per company policy, this review process is confidential. Discussion of the review with other employees, including executive leadership, is prohibited until the process concludes. I couldn't tell Augustus I'd filed the request. Couldn't be pressured to withdraw it. The process was protected, confidential, and already in motion. I imagined Augustus would find out eventually. But by then, it would be too late for him to control the narrative. The documentation I'd accumulated over 18 months was comprehensive. Not because I'd been planning revenge. Because I'd been doing my job professionally, keeping records of everything. Email threads where Augustus had asked me to develop the market expansion strategy. Messages praising early drafts, calling them exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. His own edits and suggestions incorporated throughout, demonstrating his direct involvement in shaping the final proposal. Calendar entries showing the board presentation scheduled at his request, with notation that I'd be presenting the Strategic Expansion Initiative for board approval. The presentation deck itself, with metadata showing creation and revision dates, my authorship, and Augustus's approval comments. Then, the board meeting recording. Company policy required all board meetings to be recorded for legal compliance. The full recording showed Augustus interrupting my presentation at slide 3, reframing my work as a developmental exercise he'd never intended for serious consideration, and dismissing it while claiming I'd misunderstood the purpose. Finally, emails from afterward where Augustus offered to help me understand where I'd gone wrong, positioning the entire incident as my failure to grasp executive-level expectations. The pattern was clear. Augustus had directed me to develop serious strategic work, encouraged and shaped that work, then publicly dismissed it as naive overreach to demonstrate his authority and my dependence on his judgment. What was less clear to him, because he'd never considered I'd have leverage to use it, was whether this constituted a governance concern worth independent review. The independent consultant the governance committee hired was a woman named Dr. Patricia Montgomery, who specialized in corporate governance assessment and executive accountability frameworks. She was unimpressed by charisma or reputation. Her interview with me was thorough, focused, and primarily concerned with documentation rather than narrative. "Walk me through the assignment of this strategic project," she said, reviewing my emails on her laptop. "Who initiated it? What were the stated objectives? What approval processes were followed?" I walked through everything systematically. Augustus's initial request that I develop a comprehensive market expansion strategy for board consideration. His active involvement in shaping the analysis. His approval of the final presentation. His scheduling of the board presentation time slot. And then at the presentation, Dr. Montgomery asked. He interrupted me at slide 3 and reframed the entire project as a learning exercise I'd misunderstood. In front of the full board. Yes. 14 people. She made notes. And afterward, he met with me to explain that I should have known he didn't actually want me to present it as a serious proposal. That it was meant as developmental feedback, not board-level strategy. Despite scheduling 45 minutes on the board agenda for your presentation. Yes. Dr. Montgomery's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested she'd seen this pattern before. Did Augustus provide any written documentation clarifying that this was a developmental exercise rather than a legitimate strategic proposal? No. Everything in writing supports it being a real project. Why wasn't this disclosed to the board? Dr. Montgomery asked during her interview with Augustus 2 weeks later. I wasn't present for that conversation, but Harrison Cole shared the relevant portions with me afterward as part of the review process. Augustus had been surprised by the governance committee's interest in what he characterized as a simple personnel matter. He'd explained patiently that mentoring young talent sometimes involved allowing them to present work that wasn't quite ready, providing growth opportunities and feedback. But the board agenda listed it as a strategic expansion proposal for consideration, Dr. Montgomery had noted. Not as a developmental presentation. The board prepared for that meeting expecting to review a legitimate strategic initiative. Well, I had hoped Winifred's work might be strong enough to warrant serious consideration, Augustus had replied. But when I saw the final presentation, I realized it wasn't at the level I'd hoped. I made a judgment call about how to handle that in the moment. By publicly characterizing Ms. Hale's work as evidence of confusion about her capabilities? By framing it as overreach rather than work you'd explicitly assigned and approved? I was trying to be gentle while being honest. Mr. Blackwood, your emails show direct involvement in developing this strategy. You provided specific feedback on market segmentation, approved the financial models, and suggested the competitive positioning framework. This wasn't a junior employee working independently. This was collaborative executive-level work that you then dismissed as naive when it came time to present. That's when Augustus's tone had shifted from patient explanation to something sharper. Augustus left me a voicemail the day after Dr. Montgomery interviewed him. His voice was friendly, almost amused, like we were sharing a private joke. Winifred, I heard you've been talking to the governance committee. I understand. You were embarrassed by the board meeting, and you're looking for someone to blame. It's natural. But I think you're making this bigger than it needs to be. Why don't we have coffee this week? Clear the air? I'd hate to see you damage your career over a misunderstanding. The laugh in his voice was unmistakable. He wasn't worried. He thought this was theater, me making noise that would ultimately be dismissed once the governance committee recognized his version of events. These kinds of complaints rarely go anywhere, he continued. The committee knows I've built this company, that I've mentored dozens of successful leaders. They understand that sometimes developmental feedback doesn't land the way we'd hope. I'm sure we can resolve this quietly without making it a formal issue. He was so confident. So certain that his reputation, his track record, his relationships with the board would insulate him from any serious consequences. What he didn't understand was that Dr. Montgomery wasn't interviewing just me and him. She was interviewing everyone involved in the market expansion project, reviewing all communications, examining the board meeting recording, and talking to other current and former employees about their experiences with Augustus's mentorship program. She was conducting an audit. And audits don't care about charisma. The audit expanded beyond what I'd initially requested. That became clear when Harrison Cole contacted me 6 weeks into the review process. Dr. Montgomery's preliminary findings suggest this isn't an isolated incident, he said carefully. She's identified a pattern of similar situations involving other employees, particularly women, who were brought into leadership development programs and subsequently sidelined. Keisha Hamilton? I asked. Among others. Dr. Montgomery found that employees in Augustus's mentorship program have significantly higher turnover rates than other senior staff, and exit interviews contain recurring themes about unclear performance expectations and public criticism that undermine their credibility. Are you expanding the review? We're expanding it to a full governance assessment of executive leadership practices. How decisions are made. How credit is assigned. Whether there are systemic issues beyond individual personnel matters. He paused. This is bigger than Augustus expected when he dismissed your board presentation. The governance committee is taking our fiduciary oversight responsibility seriously. I could hear the shift in his tone. This wasn't about protecting me or punishing Augustus. This was about board members recognizing they'd been asleep at the wheel while the CEO created a pattern of problematic leadership that exposed the company to risk. Risk of lawsuits. Risk of talent loss. Risk of reputation damage if these patterns became public through less controlled channels than an internal governance review. The board stopped copying Augustus on certain emails. That's how I knew the power shift was real. Previously, every governance committee communication had automatically included Augustus. He'd been kept in the loop on all board activities, even when they theoretically involved oversight of his decisions. But 3 weeks into the expanded governance assessment, that changed. I started receiving direct communications from the committee that didn't include Augustus in the CC line. Questions about my experience. Requests for additional documentation. Updates about the review timeline. It was subtle but significant. The board was beginning to see Augustus as the subject of oversight rather than the partner in exercising it. I heard through office channels that Augustus had asked Harrison Cole why he was being excluded from governance committee discussions. Harrison's response had been diplomatic but firm. When the committee is reviewing concerns about executive leadership practices, it's appropriate to conduct that review independently of the executive in question. Augustus hadn't liked that. He'd pushed back, suggesting that as CEO and primary shareholder, he had a right to be involved in all board discussions. Harrison had referred him to the company's governance documents, which clearly established the committee's authority to conduct confidential reviews. For perhaps the first time in Blackwood Enterprises history, Augustus Blackwood was being told he didn't control a process. That his authority had limits. That other people had oversight responsibility that superseded his preferences. The findings, when they came, were devastating. Not because they documented anything illegal. Because they documented something worse, consistent, systematic recklessness in how Augustus managed talent and made decisions. Dr. Montgomery's report, shared with the full board 8 weeks after I'd initiated the review, outlined patterns that went beyond my individual experience. Over a 5-year period, 13 employees in leadership development programs experienced similar trajectories: rapid elevation, high visibility, collaborative work on strategic initiatives, followed by public criticism that reframed their contributions as evidence of inadequate judgment. Of these 13, 11 left the company within 12 months of the criticism event. All were women or from underrepresented minority groups. Documentation shows CEO involvement in developing strategic work that was later presented to the board as evidence of employee overreach, without disclosure of CEO's collaborative role. Board presentations frequently misattributed work product, creating false impressions about decision-making processes and credit for strategic initiatives. Exit interviews reveal consistent themes suggesting a pattern of public humiliation as a management tool, particularly directed at employees whose visibility or independence created perceived threats to CEO authority. The report concluded, while no individual incident appears to violate legal standards, the cumulative pattern raises serious governance concerns about executive judgment, board oversight efficacy, and company culture sustainability. Not illegal. Just reckless. Just a pattern of leadership that exposed the company to risk the board had failed to notice or address. The board scheduled a special meeting to discuss Dr. Montgomery's findings. Augustus was invited to attend but not to set the agenda or control the discussion. He didn't attend. Later, I heard he'd assumed his absence would be read as confidence, letting the board see the report was baseless, that his presence wasn't needed to defend against frivolous complaints. Instead, it was read as arrogance, as inability to take oversight seriously even when presented with documented patterns of problematic leadership. Harrison Cole told me later that Augustus's absence was the moment several wavering board members decided the situation required action. If he'd come to that meeting, acknowledged the concerns, committed to changing practices, we might have found a path forward that kept him in place with modified authority. But refusing to even engage? That told us he didn't think he needed to change because he didn't think we had the authority to make him. The board voted 7-2 to initiate leadership restructuring. Not firing Augustus. He owned too much of the company for that. But significantly limiting his authority, requiring board approval for senior personnel decisions, and establishing independent oversight of strategic planning processes. Augustus could remain as CEO in title, but his actual power would be constrained by governance structures that would prevent him from operating with the unilateral authority he'd always assumed was his right. The alternative, presented clearly, was that the board would publicly recommend shareholders support a full leadership change, which would be messy, expensive, and devastating to Augustus's reputation across the industry. The announcement came 2 weeks after the board vote. Carefully worded, positioned as governance evolution rather than leadership crisis. Blackwood Enterprises is pleased to announce enhancements to its executive oversight structure. As part of the company's ongoing commitment to best practices in corporate governance, the board has implemented new protocols for strategic decision-making, talent development, and executive accountability. CEO Augustus Blackwood fully supports these governance improvements and looks forward to working within the enhanced oversight framework as the company continues to grow. Translation: Augustus had been stripped of unilateral authority and would now operate under meaningful board supervision. He'd agreed to this publicly to avoid the alternative of being forced out entirely. The announcement was bland, professional, and didn't mention my governance review or Dr. Montgomery's findings. But everyone in the industry would understand what had happened. Boards don't announce enhanced oversight structure unless there's been a problem significant enough to require correction. Augustus's reputation as a visionary leader whose judgment was unquestionable took its first public hit. Not from scandal or misconduct accusation. From the much quieter implication that his own board felt the need to constrain his authority. 3 senior executives left within a month, probably recognizing that the company's culture was changing in ways that made Augustus's patronage less valuable. 2 board members resigned, replaced by independent directors with stronger governance expertise. And Augustus himself became noticeably less visible at industry events, his speaking engagements declining as companies reconsidered whether they wanted him representing their brands. Augustus resigned 6 months after my governance review concluded. Not publicly fired. Not forced out in a dramatic board confrontation. Just a quiet announcement that he was stepping back from day-to-day leadership to focus on strategic advisory activities. Translation: he couldn't handle operating under actual oversight. Couldn't accept having his decisions questioned, his authority constrained, his unilateral power removed. The board accepted his resignation efficiently, thanked him for his years of leadership, and immediately began searching for a new CEO with proven experience in collaborative leadership and inclusive talent development. There was no applause. No celebratory goodbye tour. No industry accolades about his visionary career. Just a quiet exit announcement and the immediate pivot to discussing his replacement. I attended his final all-hands meeting from the back of the room. He gave a brief speech about building the company, about taking pride in what had been accomplished, about being excited to see where the next generation of leadership would take Blackwood Enterprises. He never mentioned mentorship. Never acknowledged the pattern that had been documented or the governance failures that had led to his constrained authority. Just spoke generally about change and transition and looking forward. When he finished, people clapped politely. But it wasn't the enthusiastic reception he'd once commanded. It was the professional acknowledgement employees give when a leader's departure isn't surprising or particularly regrettable. He walked out of that building having built a $4 billion enterprise and lost the thing he'd valued more than money, the untouchable reputation as a leader whose judgment was beyond question. The board offered me a position after Augustus left. Senior Vice President of Strategic Planning, reporting directly to the board rather than to the new CEO. Significant autonomy, substantial compensation, guaranteed visibility. I declined. Why? Harrison Cole asked, genuinely confused. You've proven your capabilities. The board recognizes your value. This is the opportunity Augustus denied you. Because I don't need it anymore, I said honestly. I needed Augustus's platform when I thought that was the only way to access this level of work. But I've learned I can create my own platforms. I can build my own credibility without depending on someone else's endorsement. I'd already accepted a position at a competitor firm. Chief Strategy Officer. Direct report to the CEO. Equity stake. And explicit governance protections written into my contract ensuring I couldn't be sidelined the way Augustus had sidelined me. Blackwood Enterprises will always be the place where I learned what power looks like when it's unchecked, I told Harrison. But I don't want to stay where I had to fight for basic professional respect. I want to go somewhere that values what I can do, not what I survived. He understood. Shook my hand. Told me if I ever changed my mind, the door was open. I walked out of Blackwood Enterprises for the last time 3 days later, carrying a box with my personal belongings and the documentation from my governance review. Evidence that quiet, systematic action beats loud confrontation every time. Years later, when people ask about my time at Blackwood Enterprises, I tell them about the lesson I learned from Augustus Blackwood. Not the lessons he intended to teach about strategy or leadership or seizing opportunities. The lesson about power. Augustus thought power came from being untouchable. From building a reputation so strong that people wouldn't question your judgment. From surrounding yourself with people who owed you so much they'd never risk challenging you. He thought humiliation was a tool, that publicly diminishing someone demonstrated your authority and secured your position. What he never understood was that real power doesn't require humiliation. Doesn't require public performance. Doesn't require proving anything to anyone. Real power is quiet. It's documentation instead of confrontation. It's understanding systems well enough to use them without announcing your intentions. It's changing the rules around someone rather than trying to beat them at their own game. Augustus humiliated me in front of a boardroom. That was loud, public, meant to demonstrate his dominance and my insignificance. I requested a governance review. That was quiet, procedural, almost invisible until it wasn't. His humiliation was temporary theater. My response was permanent change. He lost his untouchable status, his unquestioned authority, his ability to control narratives and careers without oversight. Not because I destroyed him publicly, because I changed the governance structures that had allowed him to operate without accountability. I didn't argue with him, didn't expose him on social media. Didn't make dramatic accusations or demand justice. I just used the tools available, buried in employment contracts, governance documents, board oversight responsibilities, to activate processes he'd never thought anyone would understand or use. He thought humiliation was loud because his power was loud. Visible demonstrations of authority. Public displays of dominance. Constant performance of untouchability. I learned power doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's quieter to change the rules than to win the game. Sometimes the best response to public humiliation is private documentation. Sometimes you cost someone more by walking away and leaving them to explain themselves than by staying and fighting. Augustus Blackwood taught me about mentorship, though not the way he intended. He taught me that mentors who require dependency aren't mentors, they're controllers. That platforms built on someone else's approval can be withdrawn as easily as they're granted. That the most important professional skill isn't access to powerful people, it's understanding power well enough to build your own without permission. The billionaire who humiliated me publicly lost more than reputation when I quietly requested governance review. He lost the illusion that power comes from being untouchable. Because untouchable isn't a status you declare. It's a vulnerability you don't notice until someone quietly, systematically, proves it was never real. And by then, they're already walking away while you're still explaining yourself.